In this video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to continue talking about various kinds of relativisms, and in this video in particular, I'm going to be taking a look at the notion of cultural relativism. Now, one of the interesting things about cultural relativism is that it's a very recent phenomenon, and so we can trace its origin story. And the origin story of cultural relativism is a response to something that was developing in the 19th century. Maybe it was developing a little bit before that, but really it reaches its fruition in the 19th century. And that is the notion of social Darwinism. So social Darwinism is actually distinct from Darwinism. Darwinism refers to the evolutionary theories of Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin's thought talks about the notion of natural selection. Social Darwinism, on the other hand, has a particular catchphrase which we often associate with Darwin's theory. And that's the phrase, survival of the fittest. You've probably heard that phrase, and it doesn't come from Darwin. It comes from the thinker Herbert Spencer. Originally, Herbert Spencer did apply it to the notion of biology, thinking about Darwin. Now, while Spencer had already used the term survival of the fittest in his earlier work, The Principles of Biology, in passing, where he really starts to delve into the concept in society is in his work, The Man versus the State. Consider what he says here, the process of natural selection, as Mr. Darwin called it, cooperating with a tendency to variation and to inheritance of variations, he has shown to be a chief cause, though not, I believe, the sole cause, of that evolution through which all living things, beginning with the lowest and diverging and re-diverging as they evolved, have reached their present degrees of organization and adaptation to their modes of life. So familiar has this truth become that some apology seems needed for naming it. And yet, strange to say, now that this truth is recognized by most cultivated people, now that the beneficent working of the survival of the fittest has been so impressed on them that much more than people in the past times, they might be expected to hesitate before neutralizing its action. Now more than ever before in the history of the world are they doing all they can to further survival of the unfittest. Now, in the context here, Spencer's actually talking about how in modern society we have a tendency to help out not the fittest ones, but those who would not be considered as fit in society. In Spencer's view, the poor, the needy, the destitute, the disabled. In Spencer's view, the people who benefit most from society. So society goes out of its way to help those who would be unfit. That is, if we were completely left to nature unto itself, those who probably would not survive. That's what Spencer's talking about. Nevertheless, the concept that he uses, the survival of the fittest, Darwin actually does take up that language later on, but it originates in Spencer. But then also other people that we call social Darwinists take that language and then make some normative claims about it. That's survival of the fittest. That's how things are supposed to be in the competition of human societies. Some societies are better than other ones, and who will win? We'll see. And of course, the Europeans are going to think it's the Europeans. Especially in the era of colonialism and imperialism and the denigration of other societies on the planet. So going into the 20th century, Westerners have this idea that the West is the best. It's superior in every way. The West has the best technology, it's got the best philosophy, it's got the best culture, it's got the best ethics. And then World War I and World War II and the Holocaust happened, leading Westerners to the conclusion that, you know what, maybe with all the West we ourselves did here, maybe we're not the best after all. So following World War II, there's a little bit of a fallout for a while from the notion that the West is the best. Because if the West were the best, World War I, World War II, the Holocaust, and the terrors of the early 20th century would not have occurred. So there's a reassessment of maybe the West is not as superior as the West seems to think it is, coming from those in the West. We see that kind of critique manifest itself in some of the research programs of the mid to late 20th century, especially in sociology, psychology, and anthropology. And particularly where we see this is in the work of scholar Ruth Benedict and her book Patterns of Culture. In fact, in chapter 3 of her Patterns of Culture, we really see this critique develop of the West is not the best because every society unto itself looks at what it's doing as the norm. Every society is kind of the best unto itself. There's not some sort of overarching hierarchy where it used to be in the 19th century kind of thought, well, here's the West at the top, and then here's Islamic society, which is, because of its Abrahamic religion, is kind of close to Christian society, and then down here are other indigenous peoples lower on the list, and that's the way that Westerners conceived of different societies, some being better at the top and some being lower at the bottom, and Benedict is saying, yeah, but they're just different. It's not that there's a hierarchy. There doesn't need to be a taxonomy like that. They're just, here's this society, here's this society, here's this society, here's this society, and you can compare them, but there's not a hierarchy between them. It's not that Western society is better than Islamic society, which is better than Chinese society, which is better than Polynesian society, or so on. They're just different. And they also have different values. Take a look here from chapter 3 of Benedict's Patterns of Culture. The diversity of cultures can be endlessly documented. A field of human behavior may be ignored in some societies until it barely exists. It may even be in some cases unimagined, or it may almost monopolize the whole organized behavior of the society, and the most alien situations be manipulated only in its terms. Traits having no intrinsic relation one with the other and historically independent merge and become inextricable, providing the occasion for behavior that has no counterpart in regions that do not make these identifications. It is a corollary of this that standards, no matter in what aspect of behavior, range in different cultures from the positive to the negative pole. We might suppose that in the matter of taking life, all peoples would agree in condemnation. On the contrary, in a matter of homicide, it may be held that one is blameless if diplomatic relations have been severed between neighboring countries, or that one kills by custom his first 2 children, or that a husband has the right of life and death over his wife, that it's the duty of the child to kill his parents before they are old. It may be that those who are killed who steal a fowl, or who cut their upper teeth first, or who are born on a Wednesday. Among some peoples, a person suffers torments at having caused an accidental death. Among others, it's a matter of no consequence. Suicide also might be a light matter, the recourse of anyone who has suffered some slight rebuff, an act that occurs constantly in a tribe. It may be the highest and noblest act a wise man can perform. The very tale of it, on the other hand, may be a matter for incredulous mirth, and the act itself impossible to conceive as a human possibility, or it may be a crime punishable by law, or regarded as a sin against the gods. The significance of cultural behavior is not exhausted when we have clearly understood that it is a local and man-made and hugely variable. It tends also to be integrated. A culture, like an individual, is more or less a consistent pattern of thought and action. Within each culture, there come into being characteristic purposes not necessarily shared by other types of society. In obedience to these purposes, each people further and further consolidates its experience, and in proportion to the urgency of these drives, the heterogeneous items of behavior take more and more congruous shape. Taken up by a well-integrated culture, the most ill-assorted acts become characteristic of its peculiar goals, often by the most unlikely metamorphoses. The form that these acts take we can understand only by understanding first the emotional and intellectual mainsprings of that society. So in the first aspect, Benedict is talking about how cultures are simply different across the world. We might think of something as simple as homicide, killing someone else. That's always wrong. And she says, well, it depends on what you're talking about, because in some societies, it might be permissible and good, or considered permissible and good, to kill yourself if you received a certain kind of insult, or to kill your firstborn child, or to kill your spouse given certain conditions. So she's saying, no, it's not universal. Like, you think it's universal because to you it's wrong from your society, and in your culture you think it's wrong, but different societies think different things. Now, she's not saying here that one is better than the other. She's just saying, descriptively, they're different. And in the second instance, what she's saying is these kinds of cultural attitudes about whatever it is in morality develop over time in the culture as a kind of bundle. Like, all the ideas in a society kind of merge together into one big amalgamation of our values, to the point where you adhere to your culture for the most part, whether you realize it or not. It's not something we think, oh, like, here I am, yes, I'd like to sign up for my culture, please. And we tend to do that whether we recognize it or not. We follow along, we latch onto our cultures, typically speaking. And even if you find yourself saying to yourself, like, no, I don't do that, I go against culture, I'm going to go my own path, I'm going to challenge society. Well, you only could do that because that's one of the values in the society that you have, is to challenge the society. So, for example, even the famous moniker, like, think for yourself, I'm a free thinker. You wouldn't see free thinking as a value unless the culture somewhere in it propounded that as a value, one. And two, if you've ever been told to think for yourself, it's because someone else told you to do it. So Benedict is simply telling us that much how like languages evolve, and they can even be related to one another. We can talk about the Indo-European languages and say things like German and French and Spanish and Hindi are all related to each other. And we can go back and say, like, yeah, Greek and Sanskrit and Latin are cousins, but they're not identical. And they go on and do their own thing to the point where, yeah, even though, say, English is a Germanic language, that doesn't mean you know German all of a sudden. It's not that everything is the same, meaning is not all the same, even though they be related or similar. And so what Benedict is telling us here is that societies and cultures, like languages, have similar features. We can even group them into ones that are more or less similar from one another, talk about similar features, but it's not that one is better than the other. We may have preferences. We speak English, so we probably think English is the best language over others, but it's not that English is better than French, or French is better than German, or German's better than Swahili, or Swahili's better than Japanese, or Arabic, or Mandarin, or Cantonese, or Russian, or what have you. It's not that they're better, they're just different. And you do different things, and just as you do different things in different languages, and they have different rules and different norms, same thing with cultures and societies as well. They have different rules, they have different norms. One's not better than the other, they're just different. And that's also why we can say that Ruth Benedict is one of the forerunners to the notion of cultural relativism. She articulates the notion descriptively, but normatively what develops couldn't have been done really without her work. So that's the origin story of cultural relativism. Now let's get into its particulars. What does cultural relativism mean? And also, what makes it distinct from ethical subjectivism? Whereas, in ethical subjectivism, morality was relative to the individual subject. In cultural relativism, what is considered right and wrong, good and evil, just and unjust, is relative to a particular group rather than merely the subject. So when we're talking about these groups in cultural relativism, the reason why it's called cultural relativism is because in this case, the party that determines what is right and wrong is the culture itself. In ethical subjectivism, the subject determined what's right and wrong, and that's right for them, and another subject can determine what's right for them, and so on. In cultural relativism, it's the view that not just that cultures have different views, people in this culture think this, and people in that culture think that, it's that each culture is right unto itself. So if you have varying cultures where there's some sort of moral disagreement, it's not that, oh, they just disagree. It's that people in the first country are correct and right to do what they do. And even if the people in the second country do something completely different or have a completely different view, those people are just as correct or just as right, even if they do something divergent. This is a little bit different from talking about notions of social knowledges. It's not identical to that. Cultural relativism is a little bit more of an antiquated view, and it developed as a response to the notion of Occidental supremacy. So in the 19th century, there became this prevalent view in Western Europe and in the United States that the West is the best. It's the best culture. The term really is equivalent with the notion of civilization and society and intelligence. This is an ethnocentric, racist view. And then, with all this sense of smug moral superiority, the 20th century happened. World War I, World War II, the Holocaust, demonstrating that perhaps the West is not really morally superior to other parts of the world at all. So then there developed this view that really came out of the work of Ruth Benedict, that every culture is doing something unto itself, and there's really no sense of moral supremacy. Everything is right or wrong with respect to its own particular culture. This is not the view that there's different ways of doing things. It's not contextualization. It's not critical theory. On this view, not just other cultures in the world, but other cultures in the past. If you looked at Southern slave owners saying, well, that's what they did at the time they owned slaves, but since that was a different culture, they didn't just think it was the right thing to do. For them, it was the right thing to do. It was the morally right thing. So that's a very different view than any kind of critical theory or view of social knowledges that we would see today. But it also demonstrates the problem with cultural relativism. A cultural relativist has to say, no matter what a culture did in the past, or no matter what another culture is doing now, whatever they do, if that's what the culture believed was right, it is right. It's not merely the claim that Group X says this, and Group Y says this, and Group Z says this. It's the claim that Group A says this, and they are right and correct for Group A, and Group B says this, and that's right and correct for Group B. What Group A says is not necessarily right for Group B. So back to the whole thing about Southern slavery, it's not just that it's unquestionably repugnant now, but it was okay in the past. Slavery is never right and never good. But if you're a cultural relativist, you have to end up saying, no, it wasn't just a thing they did then, and yeah, that was too bad. It was right. And so a cultural relativist ends up consigning themselves to have to say things like that, which ends up being a detrimental weakness to the theory of cultural relativism. Neither does this negate the view that cultures have an influence on us. So cultural relativism is not the view that culture is a dominant factor in our various belief systems and norms and mores. That's certain. But cultural relativism is the view that what a culture collectively determines to be right given some place and time is right for that culture, not universally. It's not saying that what this culture believes is true for everyone. That's why this is a form of relativistic ethics.